Hello, welcome. Welcome everybody to our panel today on harassment in academia. My name is Suzanne Lai. I'm one of the chairs. I am the chair of the Women's Classical Caucus, and we are so excited to collaborate today with Everyday Orientalism and the American Society of Papyrologists. So this is a co-hosted event, and just to give you a sense of what to expect in our format, we have the panelists will speak for a little bit each about major topics, and then we will move into a Q&A session. So right now you'll probably notice that the chat has been disabled for this portion for the panelist portion. So if you do have a question, we ask that you type it up somewhere else and then be ready to copy and paste it into the chat when we turn the chat on. And so we're still letting some people in, and we're going to start in a minute here. But as part of what we do here at the Women's Classical Caucus is we have some essential agreements that we read before all of the events that we co-sponsor. And everybody in this room, by being here, has agreed to abide by these essential agreements. So for the duration of this session, we will be fully present and fully participatory. We will take responsibility for our own assumptions about each other's intent. We will hold ourselves accountable to do the work of sharing experiences and coming to new understandings. We will be comfortable being in discomfort. We will refrain from language or behavior that is threatening, harassing, or attacking of another participant. So these essential agreements were gifted to us by one of the facilitators of our events, Erica Bertling. You can see her information at the bottom of the screen if you want to talk to her more about these. She is an intercultural communication consultant and has helped us in many of our difficult and uncomfortable conversations. So we like to read these at the beginning of every session. All right, so I'm going to hand it over to Todd, who will introduce himself, and then I'll introduce our other co-sponsor. Go ahead, Todd.
Thanks, Suzanne. My name is Todd Hickey. I'm the president of the American Society of Papyrologists. One of my goals for the society when I became president a few years ago was to make it a safer and more welcoming space for colleagues. So when Katrine approached me about this event, I was delighted to involve us in it. I look forward to listening and learning over the next 2 hours.
Thank you, Todd. Now I will hand it over to Katrine to introduce herself and her organization.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It's really an honor to have been working together with the ASP and the WCC on this event. I'm Catherine Blouin. I'm the lead editor of the platform Everyday Orientalism, together with Rachel Mayers and Usama Ali Gad. This panel is part of a broader series of online panels that we've been organizing since the start of the pandemic, and it is still going strong. This particular panel is part of a series that we launched last winter called The Gates. The aim of this series is to open up safe spaces for discussions regarding different ways in which gatekeeping, exclusionary behaviors or tendencies are enacted in academic setting, and how it affects everyone from students to admin to faculty, and how we can together try to do better. So I'm really excited about this discussion today. I'm equally grateful for all of you who are in the audience as well. So the way it's going to work, I'm going to pass the baton to our two co-chairs for today, Rebecca Futo-Kennedy and Jackie Murray. They're going to lead the first, let's say, a virtual circle where our panelists will do some sharing. And as Susan said, after that, we'll be able to open up the discussion to the audience as well. So before I pass the mic to Rebecca and Jackie, let me just introduce them for those of you who do not know them already. Rebecca Futo-Kennedy is an ancient historian and associate professor of classical studies, women's and gender studies, and environmental studies at Denison University. Her teaching and research focuses on histories of Greeks and Romans in their Mediterranean context, immigration, especially of women in the ancient Mediterranean, and ideas of race and ethnicity in antiquity, and their uses in the construction of modern race, particularly scientific racism, the Western civilization narrative, and classicizing architecture. She's the author, among many other things, of the book Immigrant Women in Athens, the co-editor of Identity and the Environment in the Classical and Medieval Worlds, and also co-author and translator of Race and Ethnicity in the Classical World with C.S. Roy and Max Goldman. Rebecca is currently working on a book for Johns Hopkins University on ancient identities and modern white supremacist identity politics. And she has more publications forthcoming on race and the mythic in ancient Athens and on white supremacist tropes in ancient Greek history. And you can find her online at the blog Classics at the Intersections, the link of which I'll put in the chat shortly. Now, Jackie Murray is Associate Professor of Classics in the Modern and Classical Languages, Literatures, and Cultures Department at the University of Kentucky. She's soon going to be in Buffalo, starting from the summer. Her primary research area is Hellenistic poetry, its reception of archaic Greek poetry, and its influence on Latin and Imperial Greek literature. Jackie's secondary area of research is race and the classics, especially the reception of classics in African American and Afro-Caribbean literature. She's published and has forthcoming several important articles on various aspects of Hellenistic poetry and race in classical literature. She's finishing a monograph on Apollonius's Argonautica called Argonautica, Destroyer of the Worlds. And the subtitle is Apollonius's Argonautica and the Poetics of Controversy. That's going to come up at Harvard University Press. And she's working on two other books, one on the Argonautica as a calendar poem, and the second on racecraft in Greek and Roman epic from Homer to Virgil. She's also co-authoring a mythology textbook with Joel Christensen and Serena Whitke, and co-authoring as well a book on the racecraft and celluloid classical world with Anja Bittenworth. Finally, with Ishan Hutchinson and Sashane Eccleston, she's working on Patois Iliad, a Jamaican adaptation of Homer's epic. So we're really thrilled to have you two as co-chairs, and the floor is now yours.
All right, so welcome everyone to this event. I'm very excited, and Jackie is also very excited that we have this. Some of you may recall many years ago, the Women's Classical Caucus did an SCS panel as well as a workshop on Title IX issues, on different forms of harassment. So this has been something that we've been very hoping to continue bringing to the fore with everyone as we throughout the years. We have a very great group of panelists today from a wide-ranging parts of the world, as well as parts of academia, who are going to speak today. What we're basically going to do is we are going to introduce each speaker. They will then give their own personal statement, and then we will move afterwards into the question and answer time. So I'm going to hand this over to Jackie to introduce our first speaker.
Welcome, everyone. Our first speaker is Ananya Kabir, Professor of English Literature at King's College London, and she researches the intersection of the text with other forms of cultural expression, with acts of collective memorization and forgetting. And through the ERC Advanced Grant 2013 to 2018, she led Modern Moves, an interdisciplinary investigation into African heritage social dance and music. for her innovative work in the humanities. She's received the Infosys Humanities Prize 2018, awarded by the Infosys Science Foundation, India, and the Humboldt Forschungspreis, the Humboldt Prize 2018, awarded by, of course, the Alexander von Humboldt Stiftung in Germany. So take it away, Ananya.
Thank you. Thanks. Can I be heard? Am I audible? Great. And thank you, Jackie. Thank you to all my colleagues here. Of course, Catherine, for bringing us together. I have alphabetically, I have been, bestowed the honor of beginning the discussion. So I'll take the opportunity perhaps to say a few broad things about this topic of harassment, which I'm sure whoever would have started the discussion would have touched upon. These are not things that are peculiar to me by any means. But since I am starting it, I have the advantage of being the first person to enunciate whatever it is that I will say now for the next few minutes. And I'm sure that there will be ample opportunity to obviously, develop those ideas, elaborate on them and so on. I will not speak of any ad personam instances. However, all of these considerations about harassment obviously begin from a very personal space. It is that kind of Fanonian moment where suddenly you realize everything is pointing at you, and you were sort of like innocently embarked on a career of academia, thinking that all you had to do is work hard and be sincere and just do your thing. And suddenly, one by one, things happen, and there's bewilderment, there is lack of clarity. Why is all this? Why me? And then often extremely belatedly, one realizes what is going on. It's particularly if one is unfortunate enough to experience harassment of any kind as a student. It is very hard to imagine that there is something going on which is being directed at oneself from the outside. You immediately assume it's me. I must be doing something wrong. I must be getting it all wrong. So this is an experience we've all had. I've certainly had it. And it's really my starting point. It's 30 years this year that I began an MPhil in Oxford. And so I speak from 3 decades of experience. And one thing I'll say is that harassment I can speak for myself as a brown woman in academia, in Europe. Well, obviously, harassment never goes away. It starts and it never seems to go away. It just keeps appearing in different forms. And it is also always ubiquitous in the sense of I'm always observing it, So either I am being harassed or I'm observing people being harassed. However, this seems to be endemic. And this is my starting point. Harassment at each and every stage of one's career, to be experienced and to be seen as enacted on other people. Now, what is the common thread again? Harassment can be sexual in nature, it can be intellectual in nature, it can be a combination of both. But the main thing for me is that this is, as we know, it's power play. It's about power play. It's about gatekeeping, to use the terms very eloquently, kind of like framing our discussions here, gates. It's also about I understand this for myself. As one grows senior, the general sense of keeping certain kinds of people out of certain spaces also then becomes honed into target specific individuals, because we haven't gone away. We haven't, fallen by the wayside. We are still doing our thing. And therefore, at a certain stage, that general sense of gatekeeping can even become a more sharpened sense of a vendetta. That is definitely also the case. But let's also remember what I said about harassment happening everywhere at all times in one's career, and being a product of, or shall we say, a result of power play and power dynamics. What disturbs me as I become more and more senior in my career is the use or the mobilization of what we are calling harassment to continually, impact adversely on the disempowered and the precarious, in our community, be they student, be they early career researchers. And this is why it's very difficult. It's like, it's very paradoxical. The more it happens, the less you can speak about it, because, you're afraid. So fear is another very strong affect that is felt. Fear, humiliation, anger, helplessness, but all of these really often come in this package that makes it very difficult for people who are the victims of harassment to be able to speak out and address what's going on, draw attention to it, let alone seek any kind of redress. And I think our duty as a community is definitely to work out how can harassment be, sort of, what shall we say, spotted, guarded against, but also how can we wean this out, of the system? How can we safeguard those who are the most precarious in our community, and anyone indeed who is at the receiving end of harassment? Where are the institutional structures? Where are the policies? I have been bitterly disappointed in my 30-year career viewing what happens to those who feel empowered enough to harass in, as I said, either, in a number of ways, but those who feel empowered enough to be the harassers, the perpetrators, are the ones getting away scot-free time and again. And this is not because nobody. So first of all, I said there was a huge element of fear and precarity which prevents people from actually doing or saying anything. But once you start doing or saying anything, even then it seems mountains have to be moved in order for anybody to be brought to book. And I find this extremely disappointing and very, exhausting. In the last few years, I have been involved in trying to do precisely this, because I'm not scared anymore of anybody or anything, if I ever was, but at least now I know people can take me seriously because supposedly I've reached some heights in my career. So it's not that I was scared before or was, it's almost like, who's going to listen to me? But okay, now, and we have fora like this. So I've been trying my very best to make certain kinds of interventions. And believe me, they are moving at a glacial pace, if at all. So these are my concerns: awareness, support, empathy, strength for each other, but also structural shifts in which we can actually say those who have been perpetrators are going to be publicly, put out there, and they will see some repercussions of whatever it is. Most of the times I'm seeing none. So this is where I'm at. I believe I'm out of my minutes. Of course, these are, as I said, I didn't want to go ad persona. People can Google the cases I'm talking about. My name is against several, situations, peoples, etc. So find it, folks, it's all out there. But the points I'm making here are general points, and I do believe that they are issues that all my co-panelists will feel with me about and add their voices to. So Jackie, if and Rebecca, if that's okay, I'll pause here for my first set of statements and hand it over to my other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really, really important to say that at the beginning. So our next panelist is Cheryl Nestel. Cheryl has been active in work for Palestinian human rights for more than 5 decades. She lived in Israel and Palestine between 1973 to 1988, and she holds a PhD from the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education of the University of Toronto, where she taught the sociology and equity studies from 2000 to 2012, and was the coordinator of the Office of Teaching Support. She recently stepped down after 11 years on the steering committee of Independent Jewish Voices Canada, where she was instrumental in launching the IJV's highly respected campaign against the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism. She worked with her colleagues in the Academic Alliance Against Racism, Colonialism, and Censorship in Canada, the ARC, to organize a unanimous vote by the Canadian Association of University Teachers to summarily reject the adoption of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism on Canadian university campuses. She recently completed a groundbreaking research project unveiling the Chile climate, suppression of speech on Palestine in Canada, written with Rowan Gaudet, which surveys the impact of harassment, intimidation, and the suppression of speech on Palestine on faculty, students, and activists in Canada, which was released in October by the independent Jewish Voices Canada. She serves on the steering committees of the Jewish Faculty Network and the International Jewish Collective for Justice in Palestine. So Cheryl, I pass it to you.
Thank you, Jackie, very much for that introduction. I definitely feel like the odd woman out is not a classicist, but a sociologist, so you'll forgive me if I am completely ignorant of the work that you do, but you all are so accomplished. What I'm going to talk about today is political harassment, which is never ungendered or unraced, of course. And I want to talk about the report that Jackie just mentioned that was issued by Independent Jewish Voices Canada, of which I am a member. And it's a 100-page report. It took 18 months to put it together. And basically it was intended to shed light on the wave of suppression of speech regarding Palestine that is sweeping North America and Europe. You can find the report, by the way, on www.ijvcanada.org. And basically what it does is to document the impact of reprisals, harassment, and intimidation faced by Canadian activists, faculty, students, and organizations in relation to scholarship and activism in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle. So there are a lot of very high-profile cases that some of you may be aware of this kind of treatment, including that of the Palestinian-American scholar Stephen Salaita, and the firing of African-American scholar Mark Lamont Hill from CNN a few years ago. And we know about a lot of these cases through the incredible work of Palestine Legal in the States, which supports individuals who are being targeted. But we had very little empirical evidence of what's happening on university campuses on a daily basis to those who are advocating for Palestine. So as Jackie mentioned, I do a lot of work around opposing the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which has come under very vigorous attack by defenders of academic freedom and Palestinian human rights. And this has played a significant role in the suppression of speech on Palestine, and we try and highlight that. So this report, I think, has two contributions. One is that the amount and quality of the information that we've gathered is pretty much unprecedented, and speaks to the prevalence of harassment and suppression of speech on Palestine on campuses and in Canadian civil society. And it's not just a simple documentation of repression, but we really employed an ethnographic methodology to analyze this chilling effect and its impact on all kinds of institutional spaces and on individual decision-making, which is one of the most worrisome parts of the report. It was definitely shaped by decolonizing methodologies of social science research, which seek to challenge institutions, academic and otherwise, which prioritize colonial forms of knowledge production and maintain institutional commitments which impede Indigenous self-determination. So a little about the report. We collected 77 testimonies from 40 faculty members, 23 students, 7 activists, and 7 representatives of organizations. We have testimonies from Ontario, Manitoba, British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Nova Scotia, Quebec, and Alberta. We had representatives of 11 disciplines from 21 Canadian universities. So among the things that were reported to us in great detail in some cases were the following. So political intervention into hiring. attempts to prevent access to event venues and the attempted cancellation of public events on Palestine, as well as targeting and doxing, including the display of the profiles of 128 Canadian academics and activists on the website of Canary Mission, which is a pro-Israel right-wing organization that purports to document individuals and organizations that promote hatred of the US, Israel, and Jews on North American college campuses. And one of the things that been certainly, and we talk about, Ananya was talking about precarity, which is a very important theme in the work that we did. But the most vulnerable, of course, were the students who found themselves being Googled and would find that their profiles on Canary Mission would come up. And these were actually impediments in some cases to employment and even housing. Among the things that were experienced by people we interviewed were threats of violence and genuine acts of violence, often involving racial and sexual slurs and homophobia, and threats of sexual violence. Students were subject to warnings and disciplinary measures by university administrators, who respondents often described as being hostile to Palestine solidarity activism on campus. Faculty respondents reported restrictions on academic freedom, self-censoring of expression on Palestinian human rights, discriminatory treatment by academic publishing platforms, public and private harassment by pro-Israel advocacy groups and media outlets, attacks from colleagues, political interference by university administration, classroom surveillance by pro-Israel student groups, and anti-Palestinian and anti-Arab racism. Indeed, the suppression of speech on Palestine has very significant consequences in academia, where it threatens principles of academic freedom and encourages surveillance of critical intellectuals and activists and of the oppositional knowledge that they produce. Again, precarious employment was a really common theme. Over half of Canada's university teachers are precariously employed. And because of that, those who choose to speak out on Palestine fear endangering contract renewals, future career prospects, and access to publishing platforms, which are so key to advancing in academia. Unsubstantiated allegations of anti-Semitic intent, support for terrorism are commonly leveled at pro-Palestinian academics. And very significantly, Palestinians, Muslims, and non-Arab racialized participants have borne the brunt of the direct attacks on their scholarship and activism. Emotional impact of harassment and suppression was felt most acutely by Palestinian students and faculty interviewed. And hopefully we could later when we have a discussion, I have some quotes that I can share with you. And Jews, were not exempt from this, who, they're being characterized as capos or self-hating Jews. I certainly have experienced that a lot myself. And mostly, and the work of external organizations in these harassment campaigns has been extraordinary, and we've documented it in great detail. As University of Pennsylvania political scientist Eden Lustig has argued, the pro-Israel organizations have constituted a vigilante force, which has made it increasingly difficult to criticize Israel without fear of lawsuits, accusations of anti-Semitism, demands for political balance and staging of events, blacklisting of participants, and other forms of personal or institutional harassment. So despite the proliferation in recent years of attacks on Palestine solidarity activism, public recognition of the grievous violations of Palestinian human rights, and this has certainly been in the news lately, has grown. And this report signals that an atmosphere of repression and recrimination related to discourse and activism around Israel-Palestine is ubiquitous and insidious and should be unacceptable in a democratic society.
Okay, thank you so much, Cheryl. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions from people at the end when we get to the question and answer period, but I'm going to go ahead and move on to introducing our next speaker, and that is Jennifer Sheridan Moss. Jennifer Sheridan Moss is an associate professor of classics at Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan. There she teaches beginning to graduate level courses in Latin language and ancient history. She's the winner of numerous teaching awards, including the Society for Classical Studies. And I actually also know that she works a lot with the AP Latin curriculum as well. Her research focuses on the history of Roman Egypt in the 4th century CE. She is especially interested in this history of taxation and on the role of status of women in the dynamic province of the Roman Empire. Moss also conducts research in classics and Latin pedagogy, and she was president of the American Society for Papyrologists from 2015 to 2017. So Jenny, if you would like to take it away.
Thanks, Rebecca. So I am going to talk a little bit more about from personal experience. I was the victim of the field of classics, probably most famous harasser, William Harris, aptly named. When I started graduate school in 1984, I actually went to Columbia to study with William. That was my intent, and very soon became one of the many, many women who got sucked into his orbit and then spit out. And I don't really want to talk about all of what happened. You can read it all online. But in one morning in 2017, I was innocently driving to work and got a text from my best friend and said, "Oh, who was that professor who harassed you at Columbia?" And I texted back the name, and my friend said, "Oh shit," and sent me a link to an article in actually the Daily News, New York Daily News. And at that time, as many of you will remember, William was finally being sued for his behavior. And I think that one of the first things I want to say about this whole situation is that I feel personally that the entire field of classics was complicit in William's behavior for many, many, many decades. Because when he tried to throw me out of graduate school because I didn't want to play his little games anymore, what did everyone say to me? Like, "Oh, well, that's William, right? That's William. That's what he does," you know? Or when the lawsuit broke on Facebook, a classicist said, "Oh, well, you know, William just always gets the girls." No, William didn't get the girls. The girls, the women, got harassed, and the vast majority of them left the field. So if you want to talk about gatekeeping, there are a whole bunch of women who may have been really superb scholars of classics who left the field because they couldn't stand his disgusting behavior. And so we'll never even know what we lost. I know personally what I lost to William, which is 40 years of my life thinking about this and reliving it, to the extent that if you look William up on Wikipedia, you will see that my name is in his entry. So I can never disconnect myself from him. The other thing people always said to me was, "Oh yeah, William, he's a jerk, he's terrible with women, but he writes such good books," right? And this was another thing that I heard repeatedly over the years, and all these excuses for his behavior, and nobody was ever willing to stop him until 2017, 50 something years into his career. He was over 80 years old by then, when one woman who he had not just harassed, but had actually sexually assaulted, had touched her unwillingly, and had tricked her into sharing a hotel room with him. This woman finally was willing to be the brave one to challenge him. And when I read that he was being sued, I had one of the worst days of my life where I sat with my cell phone in my hand, shaking, trying to decide whether to make the call to the lawsuit, to the law firm that was dealing with this lawsuit. And I did finally do that. And I was willing to give them my statement of what had happened to me, as did about a dozen other women who came forward when they heard what happened. By coincidence, and a good coincidence, about 2 weeks later, the Harvey Weinstein story broke. And suddenly we were in the Me Too era. And that was really just a coincidence. When that happened, the attorneys who were handling Jane Doe's case decided that the best way to get Columbia and Harris to settle the lawsuit was to go public. And so they asked all of the women who had come forward to discuss his behavior if we would be willing to go public. Now, this was, you know, a different time. So when I first dealt with William, it was 1984. I know this would be hard for people to believe. I did not know the phrase sexual harassment. It was a phrase I had never heard before. I blamed myself entirely for what was happening. I only learned the phrase sexual harassment in the early 90s when Anita Hill testified against Clarence Thomas. Also another terrible week of my life, just sort of listening to and realizing that it wasn't just me that this happened to. So I and one other person decided that we would be willing to go come forward, and we were interviewed by the New York Times, and that did lead to the settlement of the lawsuit and William's retirement, for which he was paid substantial money, let me be clear. And he was supposed to be banned from Columbia's campus. And I learned a year later that in fact, he was there every day anyway, and nobody was stopping him, nor did anyone take away his Columbia subsidized housing. So I would like to say that I got incredible satisfaction out of putting myself on the line to go public, because I obviously then became, you know, a potential victim of trolls, although that barely happened, thank God. But, you know, yesterday, I just want to sort of conclude with this. Yesterday, I had a conversation with myself, and I said, maybe this is the last time I need to talk about this in a public forum, because I've been interviewed so many times about this. And, you know, the problem with this kind of harassment is, since it first happened to me, it's kind of like a virus that mutates. And so back in my day, there was no repercussions. I mean, if we had gone to the dean, the provost, the president of the university and complained about William, nothing would have happened. Now, what I've seen in the past couple of years is that these harassers now turn around and sue women who accuse them. And suddenly the women are victimized again. And these are usually undergraduates or young graduate students. And so, as uncomfortable and triggering and everything else that this is for me, it's a fight I have to continue, because we can't let victims be silenced. It just comes down to that. So I'll stop there.
All right, thank you so much, Jenny, for being willing to share that story again with everyone today. And I'm sure that people will have many questions and comments afterwards. So we'll move on to our next panelist, who is Professor Sunny Singh. Sunny Singh is a globally acclaimed, critically renowned novelist and internationally reputed academic of the arts and social sciences, locating her research interests and pedagogy in a unique multidisciplinary approach that draws on multiple theoretical frameworks and diverse academic traditions. Her professional output transcends academia and extends into public discourse and advocacy. Singh is recognized as a preeminent decolonizing public intellectual. By embracing a path-breaking, compassionate, and transgressive academic practice, she is today one of the UK's leading champions for inclusion across all aspects of society. All right, welcome, Sunny.
Unmute myself. Well, thank you for having me here. What I'm going to say is sort of draws on all my colleagues who have laid out, I think, the parameters of our discussion very well. And I'll keep it quite short, because I think it's important that we have more of a discussion. And hopefully lots of other people who are here can join in. So I have a fairly non-traditional route into academia, and I've worked in all kinds of industries for a long time. So the one thing I can say is, I think Ananya said it, harassment is endemic, and it's not just academia. It is right across the board in every possible industry I can imagine. I think there are certain aspects that make harassment in academia harder to address. And I think a large part of that is how in multiple countries across Europe and North America, as well as Asia, academia is often perceived as a relatively liberal or progressive or even leftist space. By default, this means that there is not just a perception outside academia, but very often, and more dangerously, I think, for those who are victims and survivors, within academia and of academics themselves, where very, very often abusers are protected, not only institutionally and structurally, but also by this idea that somehow, given their output, which may be, intellectually liberal and political areas, therefore their conduct must also be so. And I think that's a harder space to then address. Curiously enough, this is linked to something else, which is academia valorizes, creates this mythology around intellectual production and intellectual labor. And very often abusers are excused, as was said earlier. Writes great books, what a great mind, wonderful person. And yet, on the flip side, that idea of this great mind producing great, works for humanity tends to penalize the victim survivor, because that same respect of what a great mind is not afforded to the victim survivor, who is in multiple ways structurally and historically marginalized. What is also, of course, really interesting, and I find that really fascinating, how we work on that, is academia, and we cannot take this away from, and right across the board, because across the globe, we live in a post-colonial society. Academia, to paraphrase bell hooks, is a structure that is imperial, white supremacist, capitalist, heteropatriarchal. That means that any of us who do not occupy and sign on to this completely and absolutely are not only just the anomalies, but we are destabilizing it just by our very existence. So when I saw the write-up for this panel, and this idea of gatekeeping and gates, I kept thinking of Sarah Ahmed's analogy of doors. Doors that are open, doors that are closed, doors that get slammed shut, revolving doors. And one of the things that happens is, of course, when you do enter, whether it's as a student or as an administrator or a faculty member, a scholar, when you enter a space that is not structured for you, that is actively built to keep you not only out, but to keep you oppressed, and to treat you inequitably, and not only that, to construct the tools of oppression. And I do want to specifically think about this one. Academia, for as long as we know it, or in its modern or post-colonial avatar, is where knowledge is produced. That knowledge is imperial, capitalist, white supremacist, heteropatriarchal. When we enter this structure, we are automatically the enemy. And unfortunately, we aren't told that. Unfortunately, we are sold the myth of that same progressive, liberal, intellectual structure, where potentially we are there to, because they're expanding, they're opening the doors, they're When I joined British academia, the code was widening participation, which is a wonderful phrase. It doesn't mean very much, but it sounds really wonderful. And none of it actually addresses the fact that just by being in that structure, we destabilize it. Just by being in the structure, we are the enemy, and we must be either destroyed or pushed out. Now, I have had a very weird, trajectory into academia, but I do want to think about how this plays out to colleagues, to students, to all members of our academic community who are in precarious and vulnerable situations. So, harassment is on multiple scales. It can be sexual, it doesn't need to be, it can also be physical, it can be multiple levels. And so I just want to bring it back to, I suppose, to myself. I'm a woman of color. I'm from a former colony. I'm a migrant. I can go down this list as to all the ways that I'm not supposed to be in academia, especially in the mothership of the empire. And that, of course, means that not only am I multiply targeted, I'm not only multiply vulnerable on multiple intersections, on various intersections of identity and experience, but I'm also a threat on all of those. And that often means that the attacks, the harassment, the constant whittling away doesn't just come from senior colleagues or senior administrators or even fellow academics. And I think this is where I'm going to throw in a slightly different idea, or a different parameter, I guess. Very often that harassment, especially for minoritized colleagues, women of color, migrants, etc., comes from students. Students who feel that we do not belong. Students who will spend an enormous amount of energy, not only harassing, but minoritized faculty and minoritized scholars who may be precarious for multiple reasons, whether it's visa regimes or it's or 0-hour contracts. But those students who are capable and able and knowledgeable about how to not only harass, but to also activate the entire structure that is constructed for them and not for someone like me. And I think we need to start talking about this, especially when I see younger students, well, I see my students, I see minoritized students, and I see my junior colleagues. And I really think these are questions and these are ideas that we must share with them. I know when I entered academia 25 years ago, I was desperate for one thing. I just wanted to, I had worked in enough industries where I actually just wanted to live in a place where I could show up in my jeans and ratty, sweatshirt and be a brain. I did not want to be another person, another thing for a while. I didn't want to be a body. I just want to be thought about as a brain. And unfortunately, of course, it was very quickly made clear to me that even in academia, being a brain is a privilege that is granted to people who are not like me. Yet it was the gaslighting that I think took the largest toll. It was being confronted by harassment. It was being confronted by abuse and violence in multiple ways, or the threat of violence in multiple ways, where I could not possibly accept that I could be treated yet again like a piece of meat. I had worked so hard to have become a brain and to find myself degraded was perhaps one of the most difficult things to do. And curiously enough, it was in the middle of something. I went to Twitter, and in fact, there's somewhere on Twitter there's a tweet of mine from 2014, or possibly even earlier, where I said, you know, this has happened at work, and on an account just popped up and said, do you realize this is sexual harassment? And it was a strange moment to realize that after having written on it, after worked on it, and, you know, I had not thought of sexual harassment as applying to myself. And the reason for that was because of these messy places of power. What does it mean to be an academic when a student's harassing you? What does it mean to be a woman academic when a male student's harassing you? What does it mean to be a woman of color when it's a white male student harassing you? What does it mean to be a woman of color, migrant, on a precarious visa reaching status when it's a citizen, white, male, straight student harassing you? And I think that's where I want to finish, because I think I do not have answers. I do have a lot of questions, have thoughts, but I would also want to learn from everyone here to see what we can come up with collectively.
All right, thank you so much, Sunny. We now have for our next speaker up for the panel, a representative from the Harvard Graduate Student Union Feminist Working Group. And I'll give a short description before introducing Claire. So Feminist Working Group is a community of organizers working towards intersectional feminist goals. We are committed to fighting for protections against harassment and discrimination for all student workers. We work to enforce the protections granted within our union contract and to educate student workers about their contractual rights and resources. This is beyond the contract. We also push for additional protections. This is achieved through collaboration with the groups both within and outside Harvard that work to prevent identity-based and power-based harassment and to provide recourse to survivors. So Claire, I will go ahead and turn the panel over to you.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. Yeah, hi, my name is Claire. I'm so happy to be here. I've been one of the co-chairs of our Harvard Graduate Student Union's Feminist Working Group for the past few years. I'm a graduate student in chemical biology, and essentially in the Feminist Working Group, we just kind of try to find ways to, like everyone's been saying, address this culture of pervasive identity-based and power-based harassment and discrimination that we've all been seeing in academia and outside of it. And so we kind of try to take a few different approaches to sort of changing or trying to advocate for protections for survivors of this discrimination and harassment. So part of that is just community care work, providing a space for the victims of this harassment to come to and feel heard and not feel like, you know, they have to be unraveled in the university process or talking to administrators who might not always be on their side, that they have a space where they can go, where they have people who are trained, who know all of the resources and rights available to them, and who are just consistently and constantly on their side throughout the process, whatever that means for their story. So part of that work is, yeah, just support and listening with the proper training. And part of our work is also on sort of policy and procedural reform. So we do a lot of advocacy in that space. So obviously there's a lot of Title IX policy reform that we work with, but also we are trying to put reforms on Harvard's identity and power-based harassment and discrimination proceedings outside of just sex and gender-based harassment and discrimination as well. And so kind of the main, I guess, summary points that we've come to in this sort of policy reform work that we do, which has been the compilation of tons and tons and decades of stories from survivors of many different, specifically faculty member harassers that we've had, our big kind of asks are really to have more third-party involvement in these procedures. So essentially, as the process works now, there's sort of full-time Harvard payroll positions that make up the panelists for Title IX and other harassment and discrimination cases. And these are the people who are doing the fact-finding for these cases, who are deciding what evidence is viable, who are deciding eventually what the outcome of the case is. And so clearly there seems to be some conflict of interest there. And so one of our biggest pushes is trying to get more independent third-party people doing the adjudication and the investigation, which is something that's been done before, that's recommended by Title IX. It's not, a huge ask, and it seems like a really concrete move towards something a little bit more fair, at least. And then another thing that we're really pushing for is access to free legal counsel. So something that obviously comes up in a lot of these cases, if they do end up going to court, or even before that, is that there's just a huge widening of any power imbalance that's already present between sort of the survivor and the harasser, or the alleged harasser in these cases. And that's money. People who can afford better legal teams, people who can afford experts to tell them the secret hidden rules that are present in these policies are going to have a huge advantage. And so just having access to legal counsel for everybody who wants it is, for us, again, a huge ask to kind of at least just make it a little bit more of an equitable process. So that's kind of our main tenets that we've been pushing in terms of policy reform. We do a lot of work kind of bargaining back and forth with the university administration, which, as one can imagine, is really slow work. But I think in the meantime, some of the work that we've found to be a little more, we can actually see the impact more, is just community care and support networks, and trying to do educational work to empower everyone within our community to have all the information they might need about who they can talk to, where they can go, who is a safe person to speak to, who's not, things like that. So kind of just expanding the Whisper network to a much more, real and deliberate network of information that people can have access to, and making sure that, everyone is empowered as much as possible with all the information that we have, and with the knowledge that we at least are one sort of beacon of support within the graduate student community. We also do kind of educational work with faculty and admin, people who have maybe a little bit more say in policy, or people who might even be invited to be on these panels. So we do, a lot of like educational seminars, work like that. But I think, as we've all been saying, it's a big beast to tackle. And so we're always kind of trying to imagine new ways to restructure, not just, the procedural stuff that happens once harassment has already occurred, but also, working towards a better culture of prevention. And that's something I would love to discuss more in this panel. I think something that we've found as has been, I guess, most effective in terms of getting through to people with more power and more say is being as loud as possible. We've hosted a lot of rallies. We've tried to contact as much press as possible about, when there are sexual harassment cases going on, when there are, new discrimination and harassment policies being put in place. We just try to be as loud and as consistent as possible. But I would love to hear any discussion about, how do we work together to, to respond and to prevent and to care for each other in effective ways. But again, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Okay, and now before we turn it over to Jackie to help moderate the question and answer period with all of the panelists and with those of you who have come today. One of our groups could not attend the event. They became ill and were unable to attend. And that is a representative from the group Our Harvard Can Do Better. So first I will describe the group, and then they actually presented us with a statement that they asked us to read in place of their being able to present today and discuss. So Harvard Can Do Better is an undergraduate campaign working to end the institutional and cultural enablers of sexual violence at Harvard University through survivor-centric and intersectional advocacy. Their focus is a campus safe for survivors of all identities, and they believe that a policy under which survivors are supported and abusers face commensurate sanctions is critical to fostering an enduring cultural shift. They advocate for specific resources and support for survivors from historically marginalized communities, including for communities of color and for trans, queer, and gender non-conforming survivors, in recognition of the intersections of racism, transphobia, homophobia, and sexual violence that often are not addressed by campus resources. And then I'm going to go ahead and read their statement, and then Jackie, you can take over for the question and answer period. So they've drafted the following, quote, "We deeply regret our inability to participate in today's panel, but we wanted to send our solidarity and appreciation for everyone who is making space to think about this important topic. Our 10-year history has shown us that sexual violence is wielded as a tool of patriarchy across contexts and across academic institutions. Leaders in academia, including our home, Harvard University, have largely ignored their responsibility to fight sexual violence to great human and intellectual cost. What we will contribute to the panel today is simply this. The only way to end sexual violence is to start. Abolitionist feminist Mariame Kaba says we need, quote, a million little experiments, end quote, to advance a more just world. Whether it is a union that can fight for real recourse, an education program, or an informal whisper network, we can create things right now that help prevent sexual violence and respond appropriately if it occurs. The fight against sexual violence is exhausting and draining, and hopeful and generative. We hope this panel will be a place to share and empathize and to plot and strategize. Thank you so much. All right, Jackie.
Well, thank you, Rebecca, for reading that. And thank you to all the panelists for elucidating the major problem that we have from different angles. And I think it would be great to get you to start a discussion. And I just wanted to I like the way that the panel went, where we, even though we went for alphabetically, it worked out quite well, where we had our last speaker was talking about maybe some solutions or at least some guardrails we can work with. But yeah, we're dealing though with people who have so much power, especially in different forms of the dynamic, whether it's the student versus the harassing professor, or the professor, because they're a marginalized identity, are also harassed by students. And we're dealing with systems of political oppression that are infiltrating the so-called liberal space of the academy, and using the idea of free speech as a way of silencing others. So we're dealing with a behemoth, and getting around or trying to stop this is going to be quite difficult. So I'm going to open it up to the panelists first to maybe if you have questions for each other, we could start there, and then we can open up the chat. Suzanne, you want to open up the chat so that we can have questions from our audience as we go forward. So first I'll have the panelists. If you have questions for each other, or want to expand a bit more on what you said, now is the moment. Anyone want to do that before we open it up to everyone else? No? Okay, there we go. Cheryl?
Admittedly, the situation that I'm talking about differs from most of the others that have been explained. But I think one of the things that impacts everyone in academia is, the way funding has been reduced to so many departments and places, and particularly women's studies and the more marginalized disciplines. Certainly in the case of Palestine work, we have the impact of donors on the politics of departmental and administrative politics has been really significant. We had a big case here with someone who was to be hired by the law school, where there was intervention by donors, and the offer was rescinded, and it became a huge scandal, and the the Canadian Association for University Teachers put a censure on the University of Toronto for doing that. But we see that because people are so starved for resources, that donors seem to have a bigger voice sometimes in what happens in departments, who gets hired, what kinds of programs are set up. And I'm wondering whether that other people have felt the impact of that at all.
Well, that's certainly something that happens certainly at my university, where you have a lot of, it's a public university, but we have a lot of right-wing donors, famously the Koch brothers at one point. And so that, determining what kind of, new investment is going to be made. We currently have a dean who's on record saying that she wants to reduce the amount of faculty in humanities who like tenured faculty, and give all those positions to STEM, et cetera. So, and then of course I'm in Kentucky. So any minute now, there's going to be some legislation that the state will try to pass. The governor will probably stop it, but the state will try to pass that will prevent discussions of race, LGBTQ rights, abortion rights, whatever. Like, so yeah, so definitely there's these external forces that are empowering harassers, we might say, to wield weapons that they didn't have before. And yeah, so we should never, I think, forget the political dimension, because that can also be wielded as a technology against those who are interested in equity. Anyone else before we go to the chat? All right, there are some questions in the chat already. One is, pardon, you answered?
Ananya has her hand up.
Yes.
Oh, there's a hand up. Okay, I thought it was, okay. Go ahead with the hand. Who has your hand up? Go ahead.
Yes, sorry, it was me. So I just wanted to say a couple of things. There's something in the chat that actually speaks to what I wanted to just say a little bit more about. This is the comment from Debbie Sneed, where she says that, it's like those who complain are likely then to be actually counter complained against, or seen as actually the problems. And it goes back to, again, one of us did say how, there's this whole sense in which before you can say anything, you are sued, right? I mean, this is becoming, I've actually faced this myself, where I have been harassed, by colleagues, by academics, and non-academics as well. Anybody, as I said, this whole vendetta culture, right? And before I have been able to say or do anything or wonder how I tackle this, letters have gone to my institution about me, right? Claiming that I'm doing X, Y, and Z. And it is astonishing that those claims correspond bizarrely to exactly what they're doing to me. It is. So I have realized this is now an interesting tactic, and I have been at its receiving end, not once, not twice, but at least 3 times. So I now realize that this is something that it's very commonplace. I think people feel, I don't know what psychology is underneath it, but it's quite clear that if they're a plagiarist, they will say you are plagiarizing them. If they're harassing you, they'll say you are harassing them. And as I've said, that now this is a new interesting snowballing effect that people feel they can write to an institution where a scholar is legitimately employed and just doing her own work and actually say these things. Now, I cannot say too much more about these cases because actually some of them are even live as we speak. So I'm not able to go into too many details. Suffice it to say that I have been, how did I protect myself? Or, how did I stand up for myself? What did I do when these when these incidents were brought to my notice by office holders in my institution? And I was able to show a paper trail, email trail, whatever, there's evidence that the opposite had actually happened, and this I was able to demonstrate convincingly enough that, there was no way that I was doing these things. On the other hand, they were doing those things, and they were using their claims to actually deepen the harassment, etc. So I had evidence. I had a good record in my institution. Now, this is what also Sunny said, that, we seem to have to work extra hard to make sure that we are somehow spotless when, the spotlight is shone on us. So nobody could find fault with anything I was doing, quite the opposite. So it was, I was protected in a way by my own track record. It doesn't have to be like that. Anybody and everybody should be protected, but that was what I had on my side. And the third thing I had on my side is I had very good independent legal advice. So I could bring that to the discussion table and say, you know what, this X, Y, and Z is what I have. And, a combination of all this really obviously makes it clear that this is nonsense. These are actually vexatious behaviors. These are in themselves harassment and so on and so forth. But I do believe that, but then that's it, Things can't go further because, this is just tit for tat. Now, I think that the best way we as a community can deal with these issues are also by certain, measures that we take as a community. For example, what is it that hurts the star academic who is usually a harasser? The star professor syndrome or whatever. Obviously, there is a sense in which they want to remain stars. They want to remain cited. They want to be important. So let's make people less important. Stop citing people who are harassers. If we know some things about some people and we can't prove it legally, but we know because we trust each other, we hear each other, then let's stop giving people oxygen. Let's stop inviting them to places. Let's stop telling our students, you must cite them. Otherwise, your chapter will be returned with big red marks. Let's just stop giving harassers oxygen. Let's stop giving them importance. Let's actually invisibilize them while other things institutionally or structurally are waiting to, move at their glacial pace, but we can move at a faster pace. And that's what I'm asking all of us to do.
Yeah, I wanted to add to this. One of I think the big issues in academia, and I think those of you who've worked elsewhere will definitely know this, is that management in academia is a total fail. The people who become the managers, so the department chairs, the deans, the provosts, they actually don't know anything about management. And so their way to deal with uncomfortable situations is to sweep them under rugs, or to give in to the loudest person, who of course is always the bully or the harasser. And to me, honestly, there's no difference between bullying and harassment. It's just all the same, a different form of the same thing. And so I think that's a big part of the problem, is that nobody actually knows, no one who could stop this sort of thing knows what to do. And so they give in to the person who's going to drive them crazy. And I've dealt with this in my own career at Wayne State. And, I'm sorry to say that what Ananya said is true, is that you really need a paper trail proving that what you've done is what you've done and what you said is what you said. And no, you didn't call the person a bad name in an email and all this other thing. And even that won't always help. But I think incredibly important to document everything that happens to you, whether you're being harassed by colleagues, by senior colleagues, by administrators, or by students, because this kind of bullying thing is actually more likely to come up from the bottom. You know, the student who's going to get a B+ and they're freaking out. You know, you really need to have some kind of evidence to support what you've done and how you've behaved. And that's a shame. That we're a long way from solving that problem.
Jackie, I'm just going to quickly step in. Just picking up on what Jennifer and Anya have said. I love, by the way, this in chat, there's a term citational deplatforming. I tend to consider my citation as political, and I practice a kind of decolonizing of citational practice, where I refuse to cite certain people, the star scholars, especially from the global north, just because they are who they are, and therefore we must continue to cite them. And I, you know, it leads to unpleasantness, and yes, some levels of bullying. But I think that is a concrete strategy. But I also want to pick up on something that Ananya said, and that's JARVO is an accepted practice, and I've put the link in the chat. Most workspaces, but I think academia is particularly poor, and I completely agree it's linked to poor management and practices both interpersonal and institutional JARVO. It's a constant strategic process. It's also linked to that process of where the body that disrupts must be ejected or destroyed. So if you think of, you know, people like me and many others in the room as people who the structure does not want, who the structure rejects and is threatened by, it is possibly JARVO, recognizing when JARVO happens and is in process, and possibly even strategically planning for it is one of the strategies. And I think, you know, keeping a paper trail is exhausting, but keeping a paper trail is also an effective way to fight back JARVO, because that is something that is utilized constantly. I do want to pick up something that Cheryl said just before I just sort of quiet down and let everyone else get on with it, which is the particularly vulnerable space that marginalized scholars, whether migrants or racialized, et cetera, occupy in regard to political, intellectual forms of harassment. I think the first attempt, the first barrage of emails to my workplace about that labeled me an anti-Semite and so on and so forth, and how I should be fired, came around about 2008 when Israel was in the process of bombing Gaza. And to speak in that sense for Palestine, or indeed recently in Britain, to speak against Brexit and its complete stupidity and factlessness, is to open oneself up across the board as academics to abuse, both internally and externally, publicly and in, you know, from within the institutions. But to do so as minoritized scholars is vastly more intense. And I think we, you know, one of the ways we should actually be considering solidarities and radical solidarities is to acknowledge the fact that none of the issues, to acknowledge and practice a kind of intersectional politics, where we recognize that scholars who may be from the global south are migrants or are of color are also likely to be speaking on political issues and are likely to be more vulnerable than to institutional and public harassment, bullying, and consequences. So it's just something to keep in mind, and just that's one of the many vectors we can continue on. But handing it over now.
thank you for that. Maybe you want to lower your hand. It's up and I can't keep track of. But yeah, so from, before I hand it over to the questions, I actually have an observation as well, is that a lot of the sort of normal, so-called normal channels through which you would use in, you know, in the university, ombuds people, whatever that you would go to, they're actually not designed or even set up to help the victim of this kind of harassment. They tend to be set up to protect the university itself. And so oftentimes you find when you go to these entities, you're actually giving them information like intel so that they can then use against you. So it's really a sort of a vicious cycle that keeps the system going. And a lot of students or faculty, junior faculty, don't realize that. And even when you do these harassment trainings that you're required to do, right? If you really read carefully, you'll see that they're not really protecting the victim or trying to get a solution to that, but what they tend to be doing is protecting the university from being sued or whatever. And so that's another thing that needs to somehow be addressed in this question. So do we have any questions? We've got a lot of activity in the chat. Let me see if I can see any questions.
Yeah, we should start. The first one is
RT. I see
yeah.
one. RT. So yeah, RT, would you like to say your question or do you want me to read it?
I think we should just read them because there's a lot.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all for arranging this panel and for speaking out. My question, based on Claire's points, does anybody already have some support structures that can be expanded for us to be able to support each other as we're doing here, but more regularly? Yeah, and this is a really good question, I think. Anyone have? So I just mentioned that the normal channels are probably not going to be helpful. Suzanne?
Hi, thank you. So one of the things that we have, and it's not comprehensive in any way, but one of the things we have at WCC is our newly redesigned in the last couple of years mentorship program, which has not only a year-round like part, but also an on-demand part. And one of the things that many of the people involved in that have talked about is how they have been able to bring up professional issues with a mentor or mentee, through building that mentorship relationship with somebody outside their institution. So I would, I'd say like it's not specifically about this, but I know that, many of the mentees who have been in the programs have said that they have, used some of the advice and expertise of the mentors or even their peer mentees if it's a cohort program, because we use a multiple model program. So I can put a link to that. So that's one area within Classics, but again, it may not be, it's not enough to address this specific thing, but that is just one thing we're trying.
Cheryl?
Yeah, I coming from a bit of a different context because more focused on kind of the grassroots organizing stuff. One of the things that we found really helpful are unions of, the academic unions, even, some of the non-academic unions have been very helpful in fighting back against some of this repression and harassment. And that's been extremely important. And of course, I mentioned Palestine Legal, and we have another group like that in Canada that provides support. So I mean, those things, and we've been very successful here in Canada at building coalition around this kind of work. And I think it's really, really key for anything that you do to have these broader coalitions that extend into the community, that are not just in, you know, your discipline or in your university space, but far beyond that as well, because you can exert pressure from so many directions, and it's really, really important to do that. But one of the things that it's a bit off topic, but as somebody very involved in independent Jewish voices, we often have people approaching us saying, this happened to me, what can I do? Can you? And I spend hours on the phone with various people who have experienced harassment, et cetera. But I'm often struck by how powerless these people really are. I had an experience with a private school teacher. She was actually the diversity, equity, and inclusion lead in her mostly white private school. And she had a pro-Palestine sticker on her computer, which somebody saw, the parents organized, and they got her fired. And she had absolutely no recourse because she's not unionized. She's on the job market. And there was really nothing we could offer her at all because she was just completely disempowered by the situation. So this often happens. So people, you know, the precarity is such a huge factor in these cases because people do not want to kind of incriminate themselves by pointing out their own recalcitrant or kind of, you know, that they're trouble. You don't want to hire this person because they're going to be trouble and troublesome. And that, I mean, that happens in academia as well. But outside of it, I'm just struck often by how little power we have to fight back against some of these things because the structures are so entrenched and people are so precariously positioned.
Suzanne had, oh, okay, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to sort of piggyback on what Cheryl just said, that I am Jewish, and it really, really troubles me the extent to which people are called anti-Semite just for a variety of reasons, and it's often completely untrue, but it's a trigger to get them fired. And I've seen it happen over and over again in the field of classics, but also in a number of other things. We had an incident recently at a high school in my area where a pro-Palestinian speaker spoke, and then everybody's up in arms. I am so horrified by that, just absolutely horrified.
But I think Suzanne has a comment in the chat that actually I think sort of speaks to just the general pervasiveness or okayness of bullying in academia. Like Suzanne is talking about this low-level harassment, but it's this general, it seems like a general attitude or acceptance of like small case bullying, which is actually a gateway into the larger forms. And so I think that that's one thing that has to be really addressed, is this whole idea that that once you gain some level of power over others, you can then use that for your own ends or to keep things the way they should be, that kind of attitude. So yeah, I think that there's a basic, it seems like a basic underlying aspect of academia that involves bullying, just basically, right? That the way it's structured. So Ananya, oh, you're muted.
Yeah. So, you know, I just wanted to say that for me personally, I think it's super important and part of a solution, though it seems a bit of a chimera, but I think it's part of the solution to point out that we are having these discussions where, you know, today there've been 40 to 50 people listening in. I don't know them all. They've just tuned in, you know, we've put the word out. I personally have been part of several such discussions actually in the past couple of years. So I feel that there is a little bit of a shift in culture where at least we find ourselves able to get together in groups of whatever size and speak out about this, you know. Even airing it is extremely important because that's the first way in which a lot of other people get to understand that what we didn't, at least I didn't, Jennifer didn't, some of us didn't. Like, this is not us, it's not me. It's out there, it's endemic, it's happening, but whether it's low level, whether so, this pervasiveness, alas, of this kind of behavior in the profession, we need to be able to speak, we need to be able to spread the word that it's an issue, so people start getting alerted to it, and therefore that's the first step towards feeling that it's okay to spot it and to somehow want to call it out. I think that awareness that we are raising is in itself a very important act and step, and there should be more such. But I think every academic gathering, every conference and so on, we should have panels, not just about academic content, but academic behavior. And we should be able to address these issues whenever we can, whenever we're getting together, So I think that's that. Just let's keep at it. Let's not stop the momentum. That in itself is extremely important. And the second thing is, as I've mentioned it earlier, again, I feel there's a lot of value in our own investment in ourselves, in being able to say, I'm a good colleague, I'm going to listen, I'm going to be there, I'm going to support, I'm not going to say this doesn't concern me, I'm friends with that person. That we have to be honest and say that person was my mentor, but if they've done this, I can't, we're going to have to stand up for our own beliefs and principles, frankly speaking. And the more we do it microcosmically, that micro level standing up, hopefully at some point there'll be a critical mass of being able to change the culture, but it won't happen if we just don't, each one of us, feel able to take responsibility for it. It's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, but I think we can do that the more we talk about it and empower each other as a group. So I must again thank those who brought us together. And I personally feel let's just keep organizing these kinds of panels virtually and in person whenever we can. It's super important.
There's a couple of comments in the chat or questions. One by Francis Garrett about whether or not we've applied the new research on coercive control on in an academic context. That I think looking into that kind of research might also help in terms of at least pointing out that proving that it's happening. If anyone has titles that fit to this this point that Francis is referring to, you can drop them in the chat and we can save them for later.
I just wanted to say that I have put in the chat,
Just
today, a new book has come out on sexual, misconduct in academia. This is creating a Twitter storm as we speak. So it's the most coincidental. I'm not following the Twitter storm, obviously, because I'm here. But I mean, people are actually sending me messages on different platforms alerting me to this book.
Okay.
So in particular, there is a star professor in the Portuguese system, a star of decoloniality, who's been called out. And he is forming the focus of much of the Twitter storm. But obviously, this is an important volume, not just for calling out one person, but such a volume is out there now. It's there as of today. So I think it marks an important step.
Yeah. Anyone? So quite a few of the questions in the chat do have to deal with the everyday aspects of it, like the rumor mills that happen, and the leveraging of powerful people leveraging their social capital and networks to sort of harass as well. So it's similar again to this political or donor-based harassment or think tank organized harassment, because that's also going on, especially if you're doing the race and LGBTQ scholarship, that you're definitely going to encounter campaigns produced by think tanks. So yeah, how are we going to be addressing that? Any suggestions or avenues there? I mean,
sorry,
Go ahead.
God.
I honestly, I mean, one thing I think that's really important is that you do have to take care of yourself. Like we can fight the structures and we can try to change the world and everything, but you do have to care for your own mental health and your own headspace. I refuse to go on academic Twitter. I just absolutely flat out refuse. I've heard what's there. I don't need to see it with my own eyes. I don't need to get called names. I'm not going to call other people names. And so I just won't do it. It's there, you really do have to draw some boundaries around yourself. And whatever that takes, whatever form that takes for you, it's important, because I dare say there's probably not a person here today who hasn't, you know, dealt with some form of harassment or bullying in academia. And we all have to ultimately protect ourselves. And you know, it's also the case that if you've been victimized by someone else, you don't have to be the warrior to save the world. It has to be personal. So just that comment. So don't look for me on Twitter.
Well, definitely look for me on Twitter. I'm still there, probably there till the lights go out. I'll probably be the one shutting down turning off the lights. But I think I want to raise the fact that we can't, and sort of picking up from Jennifer's point, we can't be the single warriors taking on the entire structure. And which is why I keep going back to that bell hooks formulation. The way academia works, but is the same way as imperial white supremacist capital, etc. patriarchy works, by atomizing us, by pretending, by making us believe that we are individuals first and collectives later. Cheryl talked about unions, but beyond unions, join a union, definitely join a union, start a union in the case of US, but if you need to, but join a union if you can. But beyond that, radical solidarities don't require you to wait. They don't require any of us to wait till we kind of have a structure in order to fight. There's very little that stops us from modeling solidarities. I know there's a question around junior scholars. I remember coming in, and it was quite funny because Sarah, I consider Sarah Emmett a friend, but she was also the first person who was on a PhD viva with me. So that was my first viva I was examining, and Sarah was there. And I basically said, you're going to tell me how to do this because I've never done it before. And and as I was watching her, it struck me, there is a way we can model feminist practice. There's a way we can model decolonizing practice. And that starts with us. And that starts with how we treat our students, how we treat our grad students, how we're act as externals and we go somewhere else, how we treat each other, our own colleagues, and how we create those solidarities that let us function. And yes, that's hard work. And yes, we are all swamped and drowning. And that too is a structural decision that is made, because when you're in survival mode, then you don't have time and the energy to build solidarities. But that's kind of what we need to do. We have to find a way to balance burning it down alongside building it up. And there isn't another way out. And I know that sounds a little harsh or possibly even a little bit pessimistic, but we need that. There isn't a silver bullet for this. We have to figure out how to do both.
So there is a question in the chat that actually speaks to what you were saying in the panel, Sunny, about so if you're going to adopt this conscious citational practice, the problem, of course, is for the junior scholar, the PhD student, etc., who is forced to cite these people, otherwise they're not going to get their degree, for example. Is there a way in which to get around this, or perhaps asterisking them and having a statement that goes with them? But that even might be very dangerous. So do you have any
yeah,
suggestions on how
well,
to do that?
I mean, look, there isn't going to be a one size fits all.
Right.
Not in the least, because often, scholars have to navigate the politics, so if you have a supervisor who is willing to work with you on this, yes. If you've got a supervisor who's already bullying you into a pathway, even if it's only intellectually in a particular direction, it's going to be harder to get away with it. But you can cite oppositionally if you are a junior scholar. By all means, cite, then rip it apart. You can add it to the bibliography and not necessarily engage. I mean, these are kind of PhD level work, right? You can talk about it in the literature review, but not in the rest. There are an enormous number of liberatory, intellectual, scholarly practices that have been developed most often by scholars in the global south. So look for those in your field. Look for, not the same things, but go past that and see how you can do it. I was born and raised in a former colony. My people have been doing this for a while. And it works because you will have to negotiate. Yes, it's the harder path, but it can be done. And I would say, even if you've got a terrible supervisor, wherever you are, reach out to other people who may not have enormous amounts of time, may take time to get back to you, but they will eventually get back to you. And they will reach out to people who can support you, and whether it's outside your institution or even outside your country. One of the reasons I said, I am on Twitter is because I know there's a lot of junior scholars who follow me there. And it's important to have a voice talking about things, who is older and has, let's say, survived so far. So, find the support structure. It does exist. It's not robust. It's not necessarily immediately visible, but it exists. And those strategies are there for sharing.
Yeah, and it also occurs to me that, a lot of the effort is on sort of justifying why you're not including X great white male scholar, when in fact, maybe some of the energy needs to be toward why am I not including X, Y, and Z female, non-binary, whatever scholar who actually has something really important to say, but it made invisible because of the amount of space and oxygen that these stars and who are also harassers are taking up in people's bibliography. So that's something also to think about, as at least a thought.
Can I actually just jump in there? Exactly.
Yeah, Ananya, jump in.
Thank you. That's exactly what I wanted to say. So I have developed a practice over the past few years for removing, these stars from my bibliography. Even at this stage of my career, I have felt initially that pang that, then you realize that, it's us who build up these shibboleths. We are responsible for this citational, juggernaut. If I pull a brick out, I can be the person who makes the structure collapse, actually. But I'm a scholar, so I must have intellectual justification as well. I've pulled that brick out. I don't have that grandee in my bibliography, but or my reference, but I still need support for my argument. Why have I cited this person? It's because I'm saying X and I need some support for it, or I want to say, I know what I'm saying is coming from a genealogy. Well, obviously, there'll be other people saying that work. And as you have absolutely very rightly said, Jackie, there will be other people who need to be put there. And they can't be put there because we have only X number of words and 10 of them are being given to star performer. And they don't need any more citations. Their citations are running in the thousands, So move away, clear up space, and we've killed two birds with one stone. We are not giving citational oxygen to somebody who does not deserve it. And we are making space for somebody who most definitely does. And in that way, we make room for those people who are struggling to be heard and who are doing fantastic work, probably. We just, yes, as Sunny said, perhaps have to work that little bit harder to know who it is that we're. So I have systematically found the 3 or 4 terms or reasons for which one cited X, Y, or Z. I don't cite them anymore. And I cite some other scholars who've done excellent work. I feel quite pleased. I found them, refreshed my reading, have dialogues with new, fresh voices. They are in my bibliography. Nobody has as yet told me, why haven't you cited X, Y, and Z yet? They may have other problems, reviewer B problems, but that's not been one of them. And, if I'm going to be that, I'm obviously going to not be that person who looks at a reviewer, something to review and say, why haven't you, because I'm already on that track. But there may be other people who need to be convinced, and they need to be convinced not by negative, by actually doing the positive thing by saying, I wanted to cite someone there who is, in my opinion, the person worth bringing to the limelight here, So that's the way in which we organically bring down something that is problematic and just bring up something which is closer to what we want to see all around. I personally also want to say from my own experience, my supervisor was absolutely horrible. That was the start of my problems with or understanding that there is something called harassment, though I didn't know the words then. And I just out of desperation reached out to other people, and they were nice. They became my support structure. So I validate that modus operandi. Maybe 5 people you reach out to, 4 will not have time, but 1 will, and we've got to again be those people too, if people reach out to us.
Thanks for that. Any other questions? Suzanne, I think you have one in the chat. Do you want me to go ahead and read it, or? So how can bullying change course? If they authentically want to change and could be better, is this even possible? Many of us will have to be colleagues with our bullies for a very long time. So there's
I'm going to say something. I'm going to quote my mother. I think our mothers don't get enough citations, frankly, and I do mean that seriously. My mother always says, every time I go off on a crusade to change something, she says, people don't change because they want to. People change because you've given them no other choice.
Yeah.
And that's what it comes down to. Bullies don't change because they genuinely have had this kind of road to Damascus moment. They change because they are held accountable in different ways, and their behavior is checked and restrained to the point they can no longer act in those ways. So how we go around ensuring that will vary from one situation to another, but I think the constant holding to account in different ways, not just legal, is the way forward. And that holding to account can be as small as the whisper network that passes on information. It can be as specific as not citing somebody. Talking about picking up on the citational practice, I actually just had a paper out on a film director, and a gentleman has emailed me. I've never met him, who sort of took great umbrage at not having been cited. And I just kind of said, okay, this one I can file. I don't need to respond to this. There is no reason I should give this man any more air, including a response. There is no automatic right to be cited. End of story. Mm-hmm. So just not citing is those are all little things. These are all ways. They may feel small, but if enough of us do it enough times, that adds up.
Mm-hmm. Cheryl.
Yeah, if you'll allow me, can I tell you a Victoria story, which might brighten your day? So a couple of years ago, I got a really horrible, harassing email after being on a webinar talking about what I talk about. It was homophobic and misogynistic, and it was awful. So what do I, normally I would just say, I have thick skin, I'm not going to deal with this. But after a little detective work, I figured out that this person was a lawyer, and he was a lawyer in British Columbia. So I looked him up in the lawyers registry and was advised by a lawyer friend to file a complaint against him with the Law Society, which I did. It took a year and a half. He got censured. It became public. He was fined $6,000. He had to hire a lawyer. It felt really good to finally get some kind of, breakthrough with that. So if you have the opportunity, I mean, don't just let it go. See if there's some way that you can actually get, revenge is the wrong word, but to call this person, to account, because I get a lot of this stuff, but you don't often get the opportunity to really, take them down. And this was a really satisfying moment. It took a while, took a lot of effort, but it worked in the end. So, just to give you a little courage there.
Mhm. Yeah, I do find that the idea of putting some kind of accountability into the system is really difficult for a lot of situations. Like in my own department, I was on the DEI committee, and I had to step down because I had a fellowship. And so I said, one of the things we need to do before, make sure that we have is some kind of grievance process with an accountability factor built in. Nobody got around to that. And then, of course, when we did get actual complaints of racial aggression and harassment, there was no system. No one knew what to do. And it was all about my feelings and all this kind of stuff that's not actually addressing the problem. And it just keeps, the problem just keeps going on till eventually I had to write to the whole department and point out that we're not addressing the question. But the idea that, oh, well, basically putting the onus on the victim is always the solution that comes up if the DEI committee or whatever doesn't actually sit there and think about, well, what would we do when someone says, this is happening to me and this superstar member of our department is doing it to me? What are we going to do? Right? Are we just going to pretend it's not happening? Are we going to tell the person to self-segregate? What are we going to do? Right? None of this work is being done. And I think just on the basic local department level, that needs to start happening as a regular process of just how you're going to run your department. If you're a chair of department, et cetera, that needs to be a priority, because it's going to happen. We've seen that the culture of academia is sort of welcoming to bullying. So we have to accept that as a reality and then try to address it, I think. Rebecca, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to say too. So two things. The first one is that I served on the committee for my university to revise our harassment and bullying policy, and then to actually help craft the mechanism for having these issues resolved on campus. And they did finally get around to actually forming the committee whose job it is to hear these cases. But one of the things that you see is too often people are given the option of a sort of arbitration pathway instead, and that's encouraged. It's like, well, let's just resolve it between us, with a mediator. And I'm a certified mediator as well, so I very much believe in mediation. But sometimes that option shouldn't be offered if the case rises to the level of certain things, right? If they rise to certain levels, they need, regardless of what the parties might want, to go not to mediation, but to actually go through the judicial process. And also someone brought up in the chat earlier, Vicky, was what happens though when this harassment is with people who are not at your own institution, and your home institution is in fact helpless really to do anything other than support you. And I've been very fortunate to have a very supportive institution. But, what are the mechanisms that our national organizations have available to them, or our regional organizations, or any of our professional organizations, right? This is co-sponsored by, the papyrological folks, and also by the WCC. And these are both professional organizations who have very little recourse unless the harassment or the bullying happens on site at their meeting at that moment. And even then, it isn't necessarily clear that they have recourse of banning an individual from their meeting or of revoking membership or any such things. So there really are very few mechanisms for people being harassed by people outside of your institution. And there are still very much slow walking within our institutions themselves. So I would love for people who run organizations to maybe see if they can't come up with much more robust actual enforcement. And yes, and Debbie just puts in the comment that often organizations rely on the fact that their jurisdiction is unclear. And we could say they say the same thing about archaeological digs and other things. Wherever there's muddy waters, people attempt to get out of doing anything about it. So,
Claire, I think your hand was up, and then, or is it Ananya? I think Claire had her hand up, and then Ananya will let you. Claire hasn't said much lately.
Yeah, I mean, similar points. I think that a big part of accountability is having clear expectations of who we're accountable to and what we're accountable for. And so a part of, I mean, as you were just mentioning, a part of kind of what lets accountability not happen is that there's really purposefully murky sets of rules about the way we're expected to behave and who is expected to be responsible for enforcing that behavior and who we are meant to behave certain ways towards. And so I think that a part of the accountability isn't just in the process of, you know, response to harassment, but it's also in, you know, how are we, what discussions are we having, what trainings are we having, what sort of culture are we setting in terms of making everybody extremely aware of how they're meant to behave and who they are accountable to for that behavior. And I think that once we like have those, I guess, expectations and rules in place, and once we've made sure that everybody is aware of and has access to those, you know, expectations, that's when, you know, these excuses of murky waters and being unable to quite hold people accountable because it's unclear where and who, that's when those kind of, it can't slip through the rug like that anymore. So I feel like it's important to also think about like defining those expectations and spreading information about those expectations before we get to the point of the harassment already having happened.
Ananya, you're muted. You're muted.
Sorry, I wanted to give an example of something that happened to me recently when this in answer to the question about what about structures when the harassment is happening outside your university. So a very, very prominent star professor who initially decided he wanted to mentor me, even though I'm over 50 years of age. And then when I sort of like, you know, politely indicated I didn't need such mentoring, got all nasty and started bullying and, you know, defaming me basically through documented you know, acts. I decided that I would approach his university because he is associated with a very prominent private university in the US, not Ivy League, but Ivy League par. So, you know, I'm like, well, I'm going to write to you guys, and this is what is going on. Because there was not a sexual element to this harassment, the Title IX could not take this matter any further. And believe it or not, nobody could take it any further. I have all the documentation, all the emails, all the screenshots, everything, you know, from a kind of like systematic period of harassment culminating in defamation. And the university was just like, we're really sorry, we can't do anything about it because it's not sexual in nature. So, you know, I am really astonished the blood, sweat, and tears I spent on this issue, because it takes time and emotional energy from us, right? Every time we set out to do something, went nowhere. So, you know, I'm really, however, did it really go nowhere? the fact that I did something, the fact that there was a trail, the fact that I talked about it, and I banded with other people who had suffered at the hands of the same person, means that there is now a counter to the rumor mill on which such people like him operate. You know, the gaslighting, the defaming, the gatekeeping and so on. Well, there is a counter to that because others who are at the receiving end of that are talking together. So, you know, that's what I meant again by, and I think Sunny was right, that we can't wait for structures to sort themselves out. We also have to create our own bulwarks against this behavior. However, going through the structure, I have evidence that, you know, you can do everything and they will respond, but actually not respond in the sense of nothing happens.
Yeah, I can pick up sort of on what you're saying here. Also, I wanted to address the issue of why don't the professional societies do more about this? So the American Society of Papyrologists, which I've been an officer of for like ever, we ran into a situation where one of our members lost their job for sexually harassing a student. And I think primarily because of the decent human beings involved in the organization, we decided that we did have to have a policy for dealing with this because we didn't want this person to be able to participate in the organization anymore. It took us a very long time to come up with a policy that was fair and reasonable and met legal standards. So we had to, of course, pass all of this by attorneys because you know, you can't break the law and then risk being sued as a small scholarly association without a whole lot of money. At the same time, we were doing that with the ASP, and Todd can correct me, but it took us a year and a half probably to fully develop that policy. At the same time, I was also on the board of the SCS, dealing with some similar issues, but behind the scenes, trying to deal with some particular cases and things. And there it became extremely difficult to move forward with any kind of policies because there were too many people involved, some of whom wanted to defend, you know, friends of theirs who couldn't possibly have ever harassed a student, or people who simply refused to believe anything through the Whisper network because, well, that's not legitimate. And I tried to explain that, yes, it is, but no. And the other problem we ran into in the SCS is that every year there are new people on the board. And then you have to start the conversation all over again because those people weren't a part of the earlier conversation. And also, you end up with harassers on the board. And also you end up with these people who don't understand management techniques or the law or Title IX. Not that Title IX ever protected really anybody, but it's kind of a mess. And I finally just got so frustrated with that. I just didn't know where to go with it. And people are worried about being sued, again, because the harassers have started suing organizations or threatening to sue organizations if the organizations don't support their, you know, their academic freedom to harass people. So it's very, very complicated, but I am proud of what we did with the ASP. It was a step forward.
Suzanne.
Hi, I have the duty to call our conversation to a close. We're a little bit after the time we said. I really want to thank all the panelists and the facilitators, as well as all the attendees. We really appreciate your thoughtful and thought-provoking comments, questions, thoughts. I know that, you know, I felt I had some feels during the conversation where I didn't realize I would, just from past experiences, or both personally, but also witnessing, which is a sort of secondary trauma as well, as Ananya was saying earlier. So what I want to say as well is that we have recorded this. We will post the recording. We will also create a resource page with some of the links in the chat, as well as any further comments from the panelists that they may not have been able to say or they want to elaborate on from what they said today. So don't worry, you won't lose there. We could keep them here for hours and hours, but I think everything that was said today needs to be amplified and more needs to be said. So thank you all. I will wish you all well and hope to see you at another WCC event or Everyday Orientalism event or ASP event. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.